Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
Welcome to Planet America. Hello, I'm John Barron.
I'm Chaz the Tadallo.
This week, a reluctant Robert Mueller faces hours of questions from Congress, but did we learn anything new?
Not only were his answers incomplete, which was said in the report, but that his written answers were generally not truthful.
Also this week, the gloves are off in the fight for the Democratic presidential nomination.
And in the History Department, a warning for Bernie Sanders in the campaign of another left-wing icon.
And I'll look at the unresponsive state of America. But first, let's do this.
Break it down.
I can't stay mad at that guy. Heading into this testimony, Robert Mueller made it very clear he would not go any further than his 448-page report. He told us as much in his first public comments back in May.
And the report is my testimony. I would not provide information beyond that which is already public in any appearance before Congress.
Still, congressional Democrats wanted him to appear. They asked him to do so voluntarily. He declined. They subpoenaed him to testify, and he acquiesced. The Department of Justice reminded him earlier this week, stick to what you said in the report, and by and large, he did. But answering questions, even if only to confirm what is in a report that 3/4 of Americans say they have not read any part of, was always going to be big news. Democratic House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff walked the former special counsel and FBI director through the basic facts that he had established.
Dr. Mueller, your report describes a sweeping and systematic effort by Russia to influence our presidential election. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And during the course of this Russian interference in the election, the Russians made outreach to the Trump campaign, did they not?
That occurred over the course of, that occurred.
Then Mueller confirmed the Trump campaign welcomed the support of the Russian government, including expressing an interest in receiving dirt on rival Hillary Clinton.
When your investigation looked into these matters, numerous Trump associates lied to your team, the grand jury, and to Congress?
Number of persons that we interviewed in our investigation, it turns out, did lie.
And when Donald Trump called your investigation a witch hunt, that was also false, was it not?
I'd like to think so, yes.
So, the bottom line, Russia helped Donald Trump to win an election ultimately decided by just 78,000 votes.
In short, your investigation found evidence that Russia wanted to help Trump win the election, right?
I think generally that would be accurate.
Meanwhile, the Democratic chair of the Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler, was keen to pursue the question of obstruction of justice through the use of quite a few double negatives.
So the report did not conclude that he did not commit obstruction of justice. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And what about total exoneration? Did you actually totally exonerate the president?
No.
Now, in fact, your report expressly states that it does not exonerate the president.
It does.
But on that point, the president did not have a new defence.
There is no such a thing. He didn't have the right to exonerate. And, you know, it's very interesting. People mention exoneration. That was something where he totally folded because he never had the right to exonerate.
Yeah, I've got to say, I've always found Mueller's not innocent finding a little bit problematic myself. But what Republicans were really getting frustrated about was this.
That was outside our purview. As I say, it's outside my purview. That's beyond my purview. It's outside my purview. This is outside my purview. As I said before, I'll say again, it's not my purview.
According to NBC, Mueller deflected or declined to answer questions 198 times during the day. And just to be extra unhelpful, he refused to read from his own report.
Yeah, if you could read that first sentence, would you be willing to do that?
I'm happy to have you read it.
Okay, I will read it then.
And he wouldn't even say certain words that appeared in his report, like impeachment.
In your report, you also wrote that you did not want to, quote, potentially preempt constitutional processes for addressing presidential misconduct, end quote. For the non-lawyers in the room, what did you mean by, quote, potentially preempt constitutional processes?
I'm not going to try to explain that.
What are those constitutional processes?
I think I heard you mention at least one.
Impeachment, correct?
I'm not going to comment.
Okay.
So then Democrats would start talking all around him, independently building their case for obstruction from his report, but Mueller would jump in at the end and stomp all over their Jenga tower.
Donald Trump, 1, committed an obstructive act. 2, connected to an official proceeding. 3, did so with corrupt intent. Those are the elements of obstruction of justice.
Well, let me just say, if I might, I don't subscribe necessarily to your the way you analyze that. I'm not saying it's out of the ballpark, but I'm not supportive of that analytical charge.
Thank you.
Just quietly, I'm not sure Jeffries was thankful for that.
Yeah. Gritted teeth. Well, now, to say that Robert Mueller was being very careful in his choice of words is something of an understatement. He was asked about comments that candidate Trump made during the 2016 campaign as WikiLeaks released Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton campaign emails hacked by Russia.
WikiLeaks. I love WikiLeaks.
So what did Robert Mueller think of that?
I'm not certain I would say.
How do you react to that?
It's probably problematic is an understatement.
Problematic. That was about as forthcoming as he ever got. And after the hearing, President Trump was asked by reporters whether he feared being indicted once he leaves office and whether he now regrets talking about WikiLeaks so much.
So WikiLeaks is a hoax just like everything else, and all of those problems having to do with crime were the biggest hoax of all. It was a witch hunt.
Hoax and a witch hunt. Well, one of the big debating points, of course, following the release of the original Mueller report was whether President Trump would have been indicted on any of the charges, including the 10 possible examples of obstruction of justice Mueller cited, were it not for this policy from the Department of Justice that a sitting president cannot be indicted. Well, this is the moment that Democrats thought they had extracted a devastating admission from Robert Mueller. Take a look.
I'd like to ask you, the reason, again, that you did not indict Donald Trump is because of OLC opinion stating that you cannot indict a sitting president, correct?
That is correct.
Whoa, and for a short moment, Democrats be like this.
To the end zone!
But that little victory dance did not last for very much longer than the lunch break because Robert Mueller came back and he had something that he wanted to clean up.
I want to go back to one thing that was said this morning by Mr. Liu, who said, and I quote, "You didn't charge the president because of the OLC opinion." That is not the correct way to say it. As we say in the report, and as I said at the opening, we did not reach a determination as to whether the president committed a crime. By rule, the ball was dead when it hits the ground because the whistle was blown.
Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't so much a case of NFL as NFI. You see, rather than using a trained prosecutor to ask questions on their behalf like they could have, all committee members opted for some me time instead so that they could grandstand pointlessly like this.
You said in your report, and I'm going to quibble with your words, that the Russian intervention was sweeping and systematic. I would quibble with that because I don't think it was just an intervention. I think it was an invasion. And I don't think it was just sweeping and systematic. I think it was sinister and scheming.
What a great use of time. Elise Stefanik was so out of her depth, she asked 12 consecutive questions that Mueller obviously couldn't answer. Even when he did try to answer a question, some committee members refused to waste valuable speechifying time on his responses.
Where does that language come from, Director? Where is the DOJ policy that says that? Let me make it easier.
Go ahead.
Can you give me an example other than Donald Trump where the Justice Department determined that an investigated person was not exonerated because their innocence was not conclusively determined?
I cannot, but this is a unique situation.
Okay, well, you can't. Time is short. I've got 5 minutes. Let's just leave it at you can't find it because I'll tell you why. It doesn't exist.
It just all added to the air of pity for Robert Mueller, who clearly had to be very careful because he knew everyone was trying to trap him, but it wasn't just that. In the sympathetic words of David Axelrod, watching Mueller was very, very painful. And in the not so sympathetic words of Chris Wallace,
I think this has been a disaster for the Democrats, and I think it's been a disaster for the reputation of Robert Mueller.
At times he looked downright feeble. He asked for questions to be repeated 23 times. He even struggled with commonly known information.
You reference, quote, the firm that produced the Steele reporting, unquote. The name of that firm was Fusion GPS. Is that correct?
And you're on page 103?
103, that's correct, volume 2. When you talk about the firm that produced the Steele reporting, the name of the firm that produced that was Fusion GPS. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not familiar with that.
Let me just help you. It was. It's not a trick question. It was Fusion GPS.
He didn't appear cagey there, just confused about a very important company for his report. He forgot basic parts of his own biography.
Which president appointed you to become the United States Attorney for Massachusetts?
Which senator?
Which president?
Oh, which president? I think that was President Bush.
According to my notes, it was President Ronald Reagan had the honor to do so. Under whose
My mistake.
And this was the saddest bit. He even forgot the central word of his entire report.
Did you find there was no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia?
Well, we don't use the word collusion. The word we usually use is well, not collusion, but one of the other terms that that fills in when collusion is not used.
The term is conspiracy that you prefer to use?
That's a conspiracy, exactly right.
Look, I understand mental blocks, but literally for the last 2 years, that word has been his entire focus. It's like me forgetting the word smug. It's not confidence building, John.
Yeah, not a good look for a man in his mid-70s. Well, here, for me, was the most significant exchange of the entire Mueller appearance, and it was one that seemed to get glossed over, rather, in a lot of the analysis we've seen in the last day or so. It came from a line of questioning from Representative Val Demings, Democrat from Florida, who's also the former head of the Orlando Police Department. She was probing Mueller on the accuracy of President Trump's written testimony.
Director Mueller, isn't it fair to say that the president's written answers were not only inadequate and incomplete because he didn't answer many of your questions, but where he did, his answers showed that he wasn't always being truthful?
I would say, generally.
Now, given what we've seen about Mueller's sort of muddy answers and his confusion and word-finding difficulties, it's hard to know how literally we should take that. But if we do take it literally, she asked whether it was fair to say the president's answers were not always truthful. He said generally, i.e. generally, it is fair to say the president was not always truthful. But even if we interpret it the other way, if Mueller is in fact meaning to say the president was generally truthful, while not always truthful, that still means President Trump was at times untruthful in sworn written testimony to Mueller. And this time there was no walking it back after the event, which I have to say I expected after seeing it live. That is significant. Potentially it is perjury. That, of course, was one of the first articles of impeachment for both Nixon and Clinton. So we'll get a legal opinion on that for you very shortly.
Yeah, look, for me, there are a few takeaways as well. Firstly, it seems that Bill Barr has not been misrepresenting Mueller's decision-making process. Some thought Mueller has hinted that if Trump didn't have presidential immunity from indictment, then he definitely would have indicted Trump for obstruction. But it seems Bill Barr was telling the truth when he said Mueller hadn't even considered the case for obstruction. Or as Mueller put it,
No, we made a decision not to decide whether to prosecute or not.
Mueller also effectively implied that Trump was a liar when Trump repeatedly suggested that Mueller applied for the job of FBI director.
Mr. Mueller, did you indeed interview for the FBI director job one day before you were appointed as special counsel?
My understanding, I was not applying for the job. I was asked to give my input on what it would take to do the job, which triggered the interview you're talking about.
So your statement here today is that you didn't interview to apply for the FBI director job?
That's correct.
Finally, there was almost only one question that Mueller chose to answer all day that wasn't based solely on his report, and it was about the topic that Mueller clearly cares most about, this.
Do you have any advice to this Congress as together what we should do to protect our electoral system?
I would say the basis, the first line of defense really is the ability of the various agencies who have some piece of this to not only share information, but share expertise, share targets, and use the full resources that we have to address this problem.
Mueller actually said that twice during the day. He was trying to push that point hard. So I hope Congress takes notice.
Yeah, and he's not just saying it's Russia, he's saying it's China, it's North Korea, it's Iran. Everybody could and is doing it. Well, for more, we're joined by Jill Wine-Banks, a former Watergate prosecutor who served in the Carter administration as General Counsel to the Army. She's also the former Executive Director of the American Bar Association. Jill Wine-Banks, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you.
So we've given our takeaways, Jill. What for you were the most significant things to come out of Mueller's testimony this week?
Mueller's testimony showed a couple of things. One, that there was clearly Russian interference on behalf of Donald Trump. They intended to help the president win election. They intended to hurt Hillary Clinton, and that the Trump campaign welcomed that help. It also was very clear that there was no exoneration by the Mueller report or investigation of President Trump's actions, that his actions constituted crimes, that obstruction of justice was detailed in numerous places in the report and during his testimony, and that Congress was able to listen to him say, these are examples where there are all three elements of the crime of obstruction of justice supported by substantial evidence.
Did Mueller, though, give us anything that wasn't already in his report?
Yes, he gave us a clarity that people listening will have heard, and hearing it come from him directly, I think, is an important element. I still believe that what we really need in America is a full public hearing with the fact witnesses, not Mueller saying what he heard from the witnesses, but I want to hear it from the witnesses. It's always much more effective to have the witness say, the president ordered me to do the following. He ordered me to fire Mueller. He ordered me to tell Sessions that he had to unrecuse himself and he had to limit the investigation to future elections and to stop investigating this election. Those are clear cases of obstruction of justice.
Mueller also seemed determined to not help either party politically. For instance, with the Democrats, he refused to even read aloud from his own report. Did he have the legal right to refuse to do that?
Probably not. And I wondered about what the reasons were for his decision not to comply with, would you please read this? It is his report, and it would have been better coming from him. He was scrupulous in his fairness. And that's what makes him so credible. And that's why the House wanted to have him as a witness, is because he is so credible, because he knows how to really balance things, just in the same way that he balanced whether to subpoena the president when the president refused to cooperate.
Jill, on those questions about Trump's testimony and Mueller's decision not to subpoena the president to sit for an interview, was it your interpretation that Mueller was saying the president was generally untruthful in those written answers?
Yes, I did hear that, and he also said that there was reason to believe that there was enough evidence of his intent that it wasn't essential. Calling him in, I always thought was a waste of time, because I felt he would lie even then.
I'm no lawyer, Jill, but unlike lying to the press, giving untruthful written testimony to a special counsel, that's a crime, isn't it? That's perjury.
Yes. Yes, of course it is. Absolutely. But you have an Office of Legal Counsel opinion that says the president cannot be indicted, whether he commits perjury, whether he stonewalls all subpoenas. And again, let's go back to Richard Nixon. Part of the crimes for which he was named an unindicted co-conspirator were perjury and suborning perjury, which means asking other people to lie instead of you're doing the lie. Also, contempt of Congress for refusing subpoenas. So all of the things that are being done now are clearly impeachable offenses. He thought that there was substantial evidence of all of this wrongdoing and that there was enough to proceed without having him subpoenaed.
Now, Mueller said the reason he didn't follow up on the subpoena for Trump to testify was because Trump would fight it and it would take too much time. How much time do you think it would have taken to fight Trump on a subpoena?
It's, of course, speculation, but I can tell you, again, during Watergate, we got very speedy decisions. We subpoenaed the tapes in July, and we got them released almost immediately. It was very quick during Watergate in terms of both the tapes, the Supreme Court, all of it came very fast. And I think that you could have an expedited session of the court. You know, the court does adjourn soon, but they have been known to have hearings. When I say the court, I'm talking about our highest court, the Supreme Court. They could have done it. And based on the Watergate analogy, I would say it wouldn't have taken all that long. I'm not sure that I would have agreed if I had been the special prosecutor that I might not have said it's worth issuing a subpoena in the same way that I think it's worth going to court now to enforce a subpoena against McGahn and all the others that have been subpoenaed and refused.
Jill, one of the arguments the Republicans were making was that Mueller shouldn't have said he was not exonerating Trump because he doesn't have the power to exonerate anyone. Nobody has that power. Is that a fair argument?
It is and it isn't. Let me say that in our system of justice, even a vote of not guilty is not an affirmation that you are innocent. It just means that the prosecution did not prove beyond a reasonable doubt through evidence that you are guilty. So it means you're not guilty. It does not mean you're innocent. And similarly, there's no call for an exoneration. However, when the president started this, he said, "This report exonerates me." So it is totally fair to then say, did your report exonerate you as the president has claimed? And for Mueller to say, no, it does not. I said that there was an Office of Legal Counsel opinion that barred me from proceeding, but that I could not exonerate him because there was too much evidence. So yes, it's fair. I mean, that's the point of having the report, was to make it clear that these are the facts that the investigation found. This is based on witness testimony that was credible and believable. And so I think it's ultimately not fair to criticize that. He was asked to do a job and he did it.
Jill Wine-Banks, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
This incredibly long and expensive election campaign leading to the statistically likely re-election of President Trump 2020.
Ahead of next week's second round of primary debates, the race for the Democratic presidential nomination remained pretty settled this week. Biden leading Sanders by almost 14 points, with Warren and Harris close behind Bernie, followed by Buttigieg, O'Rourke, Yang, Gabbard and Klobuchar, with 10 other candidates still mired on under 1%. National polls are one thing, of course, but this presidential nomination is going to be decided by a series of statewide votes. So, based on the latest poll averages, let's take a hypothetical look at how the primaries and caucuses starting early next February could play out. OK, fast forward to Monday, the 3rd of February 2020. And former Vice President Joe Biden has won the first in the nation Iowa caucuses with 21.3% of the vote, winning 16 delegates, followed by Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris tied on 16, giving them 12 delegates each. Then Bernie Sanders on 14.7, but he's just missed out on the crucial 15-point delegate threshold. Pete Buttigieg is also missing out on delegates. He's got 12.7%. 8 days later, February the 11th, the crucial New Hampshire primary, and Joe Biden wins again. He's almost 4 points clear of Warren, who gets the same number of delegates, then Sanders. This time, it's Harris who doesn't meet the 15% threshold and misses out on any delegates. Pete Buttigieg again back at around 10%. In the modern era, no Democrat has won their party's presidential nomination without coming first or second in New Hampshire. So that already suggests this is down to either Biden or Warren. But let's assume the top 5 still have a shot at this. Next, we travel out west to Nevada on February 22, and Biden wins again, picking up twice the vote and twice as many delegates as Elizabeth Warren. The rest miss out entirely. And finally, February 29th, 2020, we head down to South Carolina and Joe Biden wins again. At this point, the former Veep is 4 from 4, crushing Bernie Sanders by 18 points. Kamala Harris just manages to pick up some delegates with 15%, followed by Elizabeth Warren. Major setback for her, raising big questions about her appeal to black voters. Even bigger questions about Mayor Pete's standing with minority voters. He misses out on delegates altogether. So, After the first month of primaries and caucuses, on current numbers, Joe Biden has swept the early states and is leading the pledged delegate count. What can we make of that? Well, we already knew Joe Biden was the front runner. And we also know that with proportional delegates, once you get in front, as Obama did in 2008 and Clinton did in 2016, it is very hard for anyone to catch up. Now, history says that this will be down to just 2 or 3 candidates at most heading into March next year. And surprisingly, Chaz, right now, Bernie Sanders is not among those 2 or 3. A lot can change in 6 months, and we don't know what's going to happen to the 20% or so of the vote that is not going to those top 5 candidates right now when others drop out. But as of today, Joe Biden is sitting pretty.
Yeah, we'll see if that holds though. Despite their policy differences, by the way, a lot of Biden supporters actually put Sanders as their second choice, surprisingly. So if Biden keeps dropping in the polls like he did after the last debate, that could be very good for Bernie Sanders. But I want to pick up on your comments about the hypothetical black vote, because there was an interesting poll last week from YouGov. They asked Democrats who they'd consider supporting with multiple choices. As you can see, Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren are comfortably in the lead. But if you look at support amongst whites, Elizabeth Warren flies ahead of the rest, which begs the obvious question, what's going on with her black support? And sure enough, Warren is trailing the other frontrunners amongst black voters. That is, everyone except for Pete Buttigieg, who only 7% of black voters would even consider supporting. In my book, that makes Buttigieg completely unelectable. And there's a concern for Elizabeth Warren as well.
Well, there is a little bit more niggle, I think it's fair to say, coming into the Democratic campaign in the last week or two, certainly since the first debate. Cory Booker has followed Kamala Harris's lead in attacking Joe Biden, particularly on the subject of race, while Tulsi Gabbard is also attacking Kamala Harris, essentially for being Kamala Harris.
So let's start with Tulsi Gabbard. After the last debate, Gabbard took a piece out of Kamala Harris for her confrontation with Biden, which Gabbard described as an underhanded political ploy to try to get herself attention.
Imagine somebody doing that in a debate of candidates for the presidency.
Who would have thought? Well, I don't know what Harris did to Gabbard, but this week Gabbard escalated her rhetoric even further.
I think one of the things that I'm most concerned with is Kamala Harris is not qualified to serve as commander-in-chief, and I can say this from a personal perspective as a soldier. She's got no background or experience in foreign policy, and she lacks the temperament that is necessary for a commander-in-chief.
Ouch! And those two are debating on the same night next week, so ring-a-ding-ding. But now to Biden and Booker. It started last week when the administration's criminal justice reform law, the First Step Act, really kicked in. It saw 3,100 inmates released early and 1,700 other sentences reduced, so good on the administration for that. It put criminal justice back in the news though, and Biden, who's been struggling with race issues after his dueling with Kamala Harris, saw an opportunity. He released his criminal justice policy, which is pretty progressive. We're talking ending private prisons, ending federal control of cannabis laws, ending cash bail, ending solitary confinement, ending a bunch of mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes, ending the death penalty, and ending the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. And the reason Biden's gone so hard is, look at those last two items again. The federal death penalty and the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. They both exist because of a bill that Biden co-sponsored in 1986. Don't believe me? Have a look at old school Biden.
We have to hold every drug user accountable, because if there were no drug users, there would be no appetite for drugs and there'd be no market for them.
Every drug user accountable? And this is Biden bragging about his crime bill.
It provides 53 death penalty offenses. We do everything but hang people for jaywalking in this bill.
Not very woke. So Biden's going hard with his criminal justice policy now, as is Mr. 7%, Pete Buttigieg, still trying to win the black vote. But before those two came along, criminal justice was Cory Booker's thing. He spent years pushing for sentencing reform, and so he pushed back a bit. And he said, Biden has had 40 years to get this right. The proud architect of a failed system is not the right person to fix it. To which Biden replied with a swipe about Booker's time as mayor of Newark. His police department was stopping and frisking people, mostly African-American men. We, the Obama administration, took action against them. And then he said he preferred to talk about the future rather than the past, etc., etc. So it is getting willing. Meanwhile, both these guys have also been drawn on the same debate night.
Fight night!
Yes, and Booker's deputy communications director tweeted, "Mark the date. Joe Biden finally gets his own Senate Judiciary Committee hearing." Obviously referring to Anita Hill. All four of those people, John, are all actually going to be on the same debate night next week, so look out.
Yeah, it's going to be a big part of next week's show, and this whole issue is certainly going to get a kick along after Attorney General Bill Barr announced earlier today the resumption of the federal death penalty after a 16-year hiatus. This is also a race issue because since the 1970s, look at this, 34% of executions have been black people who make up less than 13% of the population. Senator Bernie Sanders remains among the top contenders for the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination, but it's fair to say that his second White House campaign isn't creating quite the same level of enthusiasm or support as his first, at least not yet. In some ways, Sanders' surprising success back in 2016 echoed a campaign from almost half a century earlier, that of Senator Eugene McCarthy. And Bernie Sanders will be hoping that his second presidential bid doesn't fall flat in the way that other progressive senators did. This is Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota. He is not to be confused with Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. They were not related and could not have been less alike. Gene McCarthy was a Liberal Democrat.
Why are we in Vietnam?
Joe McCarthy was a fervent anti-communist Republican.
The danger of the Communist Party.
In fact, Gene McCarthy was among the very first US senators to condemn Joe McCarthy's witch hunts into alleged communist infiltration of Washington, Hollywood, and pretty much everywhere. By 1967, Joe McCarthy had been dead for 10 years, while Gene McCarthy was one of the leading opponents of the war in Vietnam. Anti-war student activists launched a campaign to dump Democratic President Lyndon Johnson. They needed a Democrat prepared to challenge him. First, they approached Senator Robert Kennedy, who opposed the war and hated LBJ, but refused. Then, students approached Senator George McGovern of South Dakota. He also declined to challenge Johnson. Finally, they approached Gene McCarthy and he said yes.
But I think everyone has had private doubts, but there comes a time when the private doubts of a public man must become public doubts.
Eugene McCarthy was a bookish, religious man, a poet as well as a politician, and as a former professor of sociology, he could relate to students and they to him.
I found that the students were genuinely concerned about the substance of Vietnam. I sensed that most of them really wanted to do something more or less within the system if they were given a chance.
In 1968, you could be drafted into the US military and sent to war at the age of 18, but you couldn't vote until the age of 21. You could, however, join the campaign of somebody you agreed with, like Gene McCarthy.
Vote for Gene McCarthy and bring peace to this our land.
And with the first primary coming up, thousands of students from around America descended on New Hampshire, going door to door, drumming up support for their candidate. Their slogan, "Get clean for Gene. Cut your hair, shave off your beard, look respectable," to win over older voters.
Some of the people might feel a little bit offended that their town is being invaded by college students, but we can turn it right around. We've come all the way out here because we believe so strongly in Senator McCarthy and want to help him.
January 31st, 1968, North Vietnamese forces launched the massive Tet Offensive.
With a bold series of raids during the last 3 days, the enemy in Vietnam has demolished the myth that Allied military strength controls that country.
Not only were growing numbers concerned about the morality of the war, now there were doubts it could even be won. Less than a fortnight later, with the shock of Tet still fresh in voters' minds, New Hampshire went to the polls. The result, McCarthy won 42% of the vote to President Johnson's 49.5. The margin closed to just 524 votes when write-in ballots from Republicans were counted. It was a stunning rebuke for the president. The following day, Senator Robert Kennedy said he was thinking about jumping into the race.
Good morning, Senator. What do you think about the surprising showing of Senator McCarthy yesterday?
Well, I think it indicates that there's a good deal of concern about, even within the Democratic Party across the United States, there's a good deal of concern about the direction in which the country is moving.
And Gene McCarthy was asked about facing Kennedy as well as Johnson.
How do you feel about it?
Well, I think it's all right. Anyone can reassess his position. I mean,
would you welcome his entrance?
Well, I don't. It's a little crowded now, but...
4 days later, Bobby Kennedy officially declared his candidacy. President Johnson was now facing the might of the Kennedy political machine, as well as McCarthy's anti-war student movement. On March the 31st, Johnson delivered a nationally televised address, ostensibly about the war in Vietnam, but at the end, he dropped a political bombshell.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The race was wide open. Gene McCarthy followed up his strong showing in New Hampshire with victories over Kennedy in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts in April. Pro-war Vice President Hubert Humphrey announced he was also seeking the Democratic nomination, but instead of standing in the 14 primary states, he focused on the states where delegates were appointed by party bosses. By May, Kennedy's campaign was in top gear, sweeping primaries in Washington, D.C., Indiana and Nebraska. Kennedy skipped Florida and lost to McCarthy in Oregon, and while losing again to McCarthy in New Jersey, on June the 4th, Kennedy took the major prize and the mantle of frontrunner in California.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago and let's win there. Thank you very much.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible?
Oh, my God.
Bobby Kennedy's death shocked the world. Gene McCarthy suspended his campaign.
No words can really fully convey the feeling that I have toward the Kennedy family in this time of their particular tragedy.
A week later, McCarthy won the final Illinois primary, but with Kennedy out of the race, Hubert Humphrey had the unpledged delegates and the nomination sewed up. The Democratic Party remained bitterly divided between its pro- and anti-war factions, and Republican Richard Nixon narrowly won the presidency in November.
That will be the great objective of this administration at the outset, to bring the American people together.
As for Gene McCarthy, he mounted a second presidential campaign in 1972, but it was a half-hearted effort. After faring poorly in the early primaries, he dropped out, the nomination going to George McGovern. And in 1992, at the age of 75, he again declared he was running for the presidency. But by then, McCarthy was seen as a gadfly. Excluded from the debates, he soon dropped out, and he died in 2005. Still, Eugene McCarthy's 1968 campaign gave voice to a new generation who opposed an unwinnable war, and his candidacy triggered a chain of events that saw a president step aside, a rival killed, and Richard Nixon elected. Congressional leaders and the White House have struck a $1.3 trillion budget deal to avoid an October 1 government shutdown and automatic spending cuts. Instead, spending caps will be increased by around $50 billion a year, and the debt ceiling will be extended until mid-2021, well after the next election. The president was keen to focus on the fact that the Defence Department and veterans will avoid sequester cuts, totalling around $70 billion.
This was a real compromise in order to give another big victory to our great military and vets.
And Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who reportedly helped get President Trump on board by telling him no politician ever lost office for spending more money, was, it seems, positively giddy by his standards.
The full faith and credit of the United States cannot be in question. And the last thing Americans need is for Washington to throw a big wrench into this red-hot economy It's creating historic levels of job opportunities and growing their take-home pay.
Touchdown dance from Mitch.
He was so excited he almost swallowed.
There was something in it for Democrat priorities as well. Not only avoiding an automatic cut of $55 billion from domestic programs, but forcing a back down from the White House, which was demanding $150 billion in cuts. Heading into an election year, Chaz, it seems there is one thing that most politicians can agree on: spending more money.
Big, beautiful world.
Now, you might recall a few weeks back when Trump officially gave up on trying to get a citizenship question into the 2020 census. Some data nerds got very excited about that decision because they feared adding the question could have reduced the response rate of the census by as much as 2.2 percentage points.
2.2%?
I know, but it's okay. It's party time because that didn't happen, which meant thankfully we could keep the 2020 census projected response rate right up there at 67%. What? Oi, watch the laptop. But yes, only 67% of people are expected to fill out the census next year. And it's not just a census, by the way. This is happening for all government surveys. In 1990, the non-response rate for the official unemployment rate survey was 4%. In 2018, the non-response rate, 15%. How about the inflation rate survey? In 1985, 86% of people they contacted helped out. Today, only 61% do. And polling is even more screwed. Pew Research, who by the way call both mobile phones and landlines, they've found their response rates dropping from about 35% 20 years ago to 6% today. That's right, 6%. Pew seemed to put this down to a surge in robocallers. There's over 3 billion robocalls per month these days, so people are getting used to screening phone calls from strange numbers. Also, spam filters often screen pollsters' calls as well. Then there's an increasing general distrust for gatherers of information. And finally, there's all the usual stuff, you know, being busy, protecting your privacy, etc. But still, 6%. So the next time a pollster gets it slightly wrong, be more surprised that they were even close.
And for God's sake, fill out your census form.
And watch my laptop.
Big, beautiful world.
And once again, Chaz, we are right out of time. But there is no concept of time on the internet.
Thank God. So we will fill that endless vacuum with all the stuff that we couldn't be bothered putting on the air in this show. See you there.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.